Fighting games, inherently being descended from arcade games, means that they're also a genre that's seen many downports to lower fidelity hardware over its lifespan. Whether it was a CPS-1 or NeoGeo game being ported to 16-bit consoles, or Sega Model 1 and 2 or Namco system board ports making appearances on 32-bit platforms, a lot of fighting games have appeared on platforms that may have been a tight squeeze from a tech standpoint. Street Fighter Alpha 3 Upper on Game Boy Advance is a go-to example for a lot of people, and for a good reason. It somehow faithfully translates the game to a portable platform while retaining a decent chunk of its animation and unique gameplay. Sometimes though, the task of bringing over the game as we know it might be too tall of an order. That doesn't mean it can't happen, but it means having to get a little creative instead. Welcome to the world of fighting game Demakes. Fighting games that instead of being ported at lower hardware specs and potentially compromising things, instead completely remakes the game using assets and code more fitting for its respective platform. For this video, we'll be looking at 4 Demakes of fighting games over the years. There's quite a few examples of these out there, but these 4 are interesting to me in that they presented unique challenges for the developers to overcome. I'm going to try to stray away from straight downports of fighting games here. I'm looking mostly at more bespoke efforts to recreate a game at lower specs. Alpha 3 Game Boy Advance, for example, despite the condensed presentation, is still largely running the same code as the arcade version of Alpha 3 Upper, even down to retaining weird quirks like T-Hawk's hitboxes being bugged and Zangief's attacks not dealing stun damage. It's a downport in every sense of the word. We're talking more stuff in the vein of X-Men Mutant Academy on the Game Boy Color. That out of the way, let's get started. The NeoGeo Pocket is one of my favorite platforms of all time. Sure, a huge chunk of it comes from being a general SNK fan, but it's honestly pretty incredible just how high quality the overall library is, and of course it has a ton of fighting games. SNK's approach to its fighting game library almost seems like a continuation of the approach that Sakura, a developer SNK frequently outsourced to in the past, took when adapting SNK fighting games on the Game Boy. There, instead of trying to recreate the NeoGeo experience as accurately as possible, Takara took a different route and essentially remade the game in a super deformed art style more fitting for the Game Boy screen size. They did this with a few games, notably the Game Boy version of Fatal Fury 2 and the Game Boy versions of KOF 95 and 96, along with some other non-SNK Game Boy Demakes I may or may not be talking about a little later. When the NeoGeo Pocket originally dropped in Japan, there were 2 fighters released in the same vein for the platform, Samurai Showdown with an exclamation point and King of Fighters R1. The latter is basically a chibi adaptation of KOF 97, while the former adapts Samurai Showdown 4 in a similar art style. SNK would later release the NeoGeo Pocket Color, and while there were some more original fighters on there, like Gauss Fighters and SNK vs Capcom, there were other Demakes too, like King of Fighters R2, essentially portable KOF 98, and Samurai Showdown with an exclamation point 2, which interestingly is an adaptation of Samurai Showdown 64 Warrior's Rage of all things. At the launch of the Color model though, there was also Fatal Fury First Contact. Developed by Yume Kobo, who'd go on to develop Gauss Fighters for the same platform and who had also done the King of Fighters Kyo, a PS1 Japan-only visual novel RPG hybrid spin-off we will absolutely be talking about at some point. First Contact is a remake of Real Bout Fatal Fury 2, The Newcomers. Real Bout 2 is more or less the last entry in the Real Bout subsection of the series, rebalancing the game from Real Bout Special, the previous release, and adding 2 new playable characters in Chang Fei and the incredibly dope boxer Rick Stroud. It retains the lane system from the previous game, though it's now positioned as a sway lane of sorts, meant for general evasive mobility, as opposed to the more mix-up oriented defense that lanes could provide in Real Bout Special. It features pretty much everyone that had been in the Real Bout games up to that point, even the now dead Geese Howard. This was originally a Dream Match game, meaning it was non-canon, but interestingly enough, it was officially integrated in the canon by SNK ahead of City of the Wolves' release. That said, it's basically a slice of life fighting game if that makes any sense. There's no plot development, and the endings are often just humorous depictions of the cast going about their daily lives. It's neat. First Contact takes all of this and condenses it down to NeoGeo Pocket Color form, but reshapes the game a bit to fit the hardware. For one, there's no lane system, which is definitely a huge cut, but it bears mentioning that Real Bout 2 actually has some stages that only allowed for 1 lane fights like a traditional 2D game, so it's not as huge an adjustment to make. Despite that omission in the game's new subtitle, make no mistake, this game is definitely Ryu 2 at heart, featuring the same meter system that shifts between H power, S power, and potential power, depending on how much meter you have and how much health you have remaining. Break shots, which are generally the Ryu game's versions of guard cancels, are even in as well, still done by inputting a special move while in block stun, though also like Ryu 2, you don't get these for free. You have to at least have your meter in H power range. Because the game is on a platform with 2 buttons as opposed to 4 in NeoGeo, the way standard buttons work are a little different than usual. Lightly tapping A or B results in a weak punch or kick respectively, while a long press will result in a single strong attack. Since there's no lane shifting in first contact, there's no need for a 4th button, so this actually works out pretty well. While some movesets have been pared back a bit from Ryu 2, they're not as cut down as you might think. It's mostly command normals that have been gutted, most characters only ever having 1 or 2, as opposed to the handful any one character could have in Ryu 2. Surprisingly, some characters even retain the target combos they had from Ryu 2 in first contact, which is nice. The art style is very much in the style of the aforementioned King of Fighters R1, with the Fatal Fury characters from that game actually reusing the same sprite sets in first contact, though first contact is notably in color now. First Contact is also backwards compatible with the original NeoGeo Pocket as well, which must have been nice for the people in Japan that only ever had the first model. All that said, I'm a really big fan of this specific art style. The sprites have a ton of charm, and they're just immediately recognizable and kind of emblematic of the NeoGeo Pocket itself. The music also consists of NeoGeo Pocket-styled renditions of Ryu 2 soundtrack, and while I imagine a lot of people's first assumption is that it sounds kind of scuffed, a lot of these renditions are actually pretty good. The NeoGeo Pocket Color in particular sports similar sound hardware to the Sega Master System, which itself had some of the best unassisted sound from the 8-bit era. The roster is, well, a lot smaller in first contact, only featuring 11 of the characters from Ryu 2's arcade release. There is an unlockable character though. Getting through arcade mode with no rounds lost and getting at least 5 S-Power finishes results in a bonus fight against Alfred Airhawk. Alfred's history in Fatal Fury is a little weird. He initially debuted in Ryu 2 as an unplayable bonus boss, but just 3 months later would become playable in the Japan-only PS1 port of Ryu Special, subtitled Dominated Mind. He was seemingly created to be a possible new lead for the series, though they'd eventually pivot towards Rock Howard instead. Alfred himself wouldn't be officially playable in any release of Ryu 2 until the surprisingly great PS2 Fatal Fury Battle Archives Volume 2 compilation in the late 2000s. However, Alfred is playable in first contact after beating him, meaning that for a few years, this was the only game outside of Japan that Alfred was ever playable in, which is pretty wild. There's also another character that gets unlocked when getting Alfred, but that's a story for a different video. First Contact definitely isn't a replacement for Ryu 2 by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a fun enough portable fighter from a time where those were still mostly iffy on portables, and it so earnestly tries to capture Ryu 2's aesthetics that I can't help but love it. These days, it's playable on Switch and Steam via the NeoGeo Pocket Color Selection Volume 1, and Ryu 2 itself is available as an arcade archives game on every platform, and also most recently got a re-release on Steam with rollback netcode as a part of the NeoGeo Premium Selection. It has a proper training mode with hitboxes, and Alfred's even playable in it. I definitely recommend Ryu 2 in general, but if you want a smaller scale demake that plays to the strengths of the NeoGeo Pocket Color, maybe give First Contact a try sometime. Battle Arena Toshinden is one of those fighting games you kinda had to be there for to understand why some folks look back on it fondly despite it not really being great. Toshinden was one of the first 3D fighting games on home consoles, beaten to the punch by mere months by the Saturn port of Virtua Fighter 1. Said Virtua Fighter 1 port was kind of lacking as far as the general public was concerned though, and Toshinden in comparison was faster, flashier, and even had 3D movement in fights in the form of a rolling maneuver. Sony Computer Entertainment America promoted the hell out of it, as it served as one of the launch titles of the system in that country, and it ended up being pretty successful in those regards, with Sony noting it having a similar attach rate to fellow launch title Ridge Racer. The game itself is a fighting game? Well, it's not so great. It's sluggish, the controls are pretty unresponsive, and the AI gets hilariously cheap the deeper in the arcade ladder you get, which isn't exclusive to this game admittedly, but compounded by the aforementioned factors. Toshinden was developed by Tamsoft, who had worked on some of those SNK Demakes on the Game Boy I mentioned before, specifically Samurai Showdown. A year after Toshinden's PS1 release, many of the development staff members that worked on that Sam Show Demake would develop and release a similar Game Boy Demake of Battle Arena Toshinden, featuring a similar art style to Takara's previous Game Boy Fighter projects. Game Boy obviously can't do anything approaching 3D, so the game itself is instead reimagined as a 2D fighting game, but keeps much of Toshinden's actual mechanics, believe it or not. First off, the Game Boy version actually retains all of the playable characters from the PS1 version, including the 8 base characters and the 2 unlockable bosses, Gaia and Sho. The Game Boy version actually has an additional character serving as the final boss and a secret 11th character, Uranus from Battle Arena Toshinden 2, which had released in arcades and on PS1 by the time that the Game Boy version released. Toshinden PS1 had a story setup, but you only really got it through blurbs in the game manual and the brief text dialogue that you'd get in character endings. Toshinden Game Boy goes the extra mile and actually has a unique story prologue scene for each character, done in this version's unique art style, and though they're short, it really adds a lot. Some characters have similar story beats like AG searching for Sho, and some characters have more humorous stories than their PS1 counterpart, like Sophia looking for a boyfriend instead of trying to reclaim her lost memories like on console. Now, this is nice and all, but this is a Game Boy reimagining of a PS1 game that already kinda plays awfully, so surely the actual gameplay in the Game Boy Demake is a wreck, right? Well, while this is still very much a Game Boy fighting game with all the limitations that come with that, the end result is something not only surprisingly playable, but arguably even better to play moment to moment than the PS1 original. Toshinden PS1 kinda has combos, but not really by design, and considering how janky they feel to pull off, you can tell combo structure wasn't really something they had in mind when designing this game. The Game Boy version, however, does have a fully intentional combo structure, even denoted by the presence of actual combo counters, something its PS1 counterpart lacks. The way the Game Boy version handles controls is actually really similar to how SNK would handle translating their 4-button fighters to NeoGeo Pocket, to the extent that I can't help but theorize that SNK may have actually looked at Takara's work as inspiration there. A light tap of the B and A buttons do a light slash and light kick respectively, while a longer tap results in a heavy slash or heavy kick. This applies to air normals as well. There's also a special attack done by pressing both kick and slash at the same time, somewhat akin to blowback attacks in King of Fighters. Speaking of KOF, while the game is only in 2 dimensions, there's also a KOF-esque sidestep attack done by double tapping down. There's also a backdash and a forward dash done by double tapping forward, and the aforementioned sidestep can be cancelled into from this as well. There's also shortcut commands for special moves in the sidestep, done by pressing A and B in a direction. Dashes and backdashes can only be dodge cancelled with the shortcut version of the spot dodge, and doing so actually carries a bit of momentum into the dodge. Doing this at close range can occasionally let you cross up the opponent. Pretty much all of the character movesets from the PS1 version surprisingly transfer over to the Demake here, including super moves. Like in the PS1 version, beating the game with a character also unlocks a new desperation move for said character. Desperation moves also function similarly to the console version, being done when your health is critically low. Honestly, it's pretty shocking that this game isn't only fully featured, but plays pretty soundly as a fighting game, even more so than its console counterpart if I'm being honest. Light slashes and light kicks can be chained into their heavy counterparts, which can then be chained into special moves, and attacks that send the opponent airborne can usually be juggled with certain moves as well. The game's soundtrack is also pretty notable, being comprised of chiptune arrangements of the PS1 game soundtrack. The music is probably the one part of the PS1 game that still aged pretty well, so it still compares more favorably in those regards, but these are some pretty okay Game Boy renditions all things considered. There's also some neat extra features worth talking about as well. Toshinden has Super Game Boy support, which among other things adds a neat custom border option, which is nice, but also colorizes the title screen and story mode character intros. Like a handful of other fighting games on the Game Boy with Super Game Boy support, it also allows for local single-screen multiplayer with one cartridge, as long as you have two Super Nintendo controllers. The most interesting bit, though, is a cheat code that actually takes advantage of the Super Game Boy hardware. By inputting a code on the title screen, you'll see the game logo turn blue. This activates Jet Mode, which essentially cranks the game speed up. It legitimately feels like the difference between playing Street Fighter II World Warrior and Hyper Fighting. It's a really cool way to take advantage of the additional Super Game Boy hardware. The next few games on this list also reimagine 3D fighting games as 2D fighters, but I wanted to tackle this one first because it's not only a pretty triumphant example of it working out for the best, but it was done on an 8-bit handheld at that. The first 3 Toshinden games have also recently been announced to be getting modern ports at some point, which is neat and all, but I'm kind of hoping the Game Boy version might show up on, like, I don't know, Nintendo Switch Online. It's definitely worth a spin. Virtua Fighter 2 is one of the most important fighting games of all time. The first game is too, for reasons that go beyond fighting games, but it cannot be underlined enough just how massive its sequel was, especially in Japan. The Sega Saturn, despite its ho-hum performance in American and European territories, did incredibly well in Japan, and having a fantastic port of VF2 was definitely a big part of that, the game itself being the highest selling piece of software in the platform. So you had 2 ways to play Virtua Fighter 2 in the mid-90s, the arcade original or the Saturn port, both of which were valid ways to play and learn the game. But Sega at the time was also still supporting the then 6-year-old Sega Genesis, which unlike the Saturn, did really well in North America particularly. Even with that in mind, it's still kind of puzzling that Sega would commission a 2D demake of Virtua Fighter 2 for the aging hardware, especially considering a lot of what made Virtua Fighter so good was its 3D gameplay. The Genesis version of the game was programmed by Guy Brain, who had previously developed the Genesis ports of Fatal Fury 1 and 2, as well as the Game Gear port of Fatal Fury Special. A few other companies were also involved in different capacities, including Data East. More on that one in a bit. Now, the Genesis isn't a stranger to having games running on it that, from a hardware perspective, shouldn't be possible. In 1994, Genesis got a port of Virtua Racing, thanks to a special chip that allowed for the polygon rendering that the game used, not unlike Nintendo's Super FX chip. Virtua Fighter 2, having run on the Model 2 arcade board, a league ahead of even Virtua Fighter's arcade hardware, meant that something along those lines was definitely going to be out of the cards for this, so instead they opted to reimagine it as a 2D game. While it's not a 3D game, I'd argue that this 2D reimagining is actually pretty decent looking, even considering the hardware. The sprites animate well enough, and the stage's foreground scrolling looks pretty decent. The game is titled Virtua Fighter 2, and the characters are using their updated designs from there, but curiously, the 2 VF2 newcomers, Shun Di and Leon, aren't actually playable in this version of the game, so it feels more like a reimagining of Virtua Fighter 1 instead. Zeral is unlockable here with the secret code though, so that's pretty cool at the least. Just highlight Akira and repeatedly press left and right on the D-pad until the cursor goes off screen. If you're player 2, do the same, but highlight Jackie instead. Virtua Fighter's biggest calling card is the depth that comes from its relatively simple control setup. Virtua Fighter at heart is a 3-button game, having a punch, kick, and guard button, but boy does it get mileage out of those 3 actions. Unlike a lot of other fighting games on the platform though, which had to compromise their either 6 or 4-button control setups to conform to the standard 3-button Genesis pads, this one actually translates pretty well to the controller without having to buy a 6-button pad. A is guard, B is punch, and C is kick, perfectly translating Virtua Fighter's control scheme over. If you do have a 6-button controller, however, go to the game's options menu and select controller type 3. This allows you to use the X, Y, and Z buttons as specific macros. X for guard and punch, Y for guard and kick, and Z for all 3 buttons at once. The character move lists are understandably pared back, but it still retains a fair chunk of moves for each character. Virtua Fighter move lists are generally pretty huge compared to the contemporaries, and the same holds true for VF2 Genesis, at least compared to other console fighters. The game's music is honestly not as bad as you'd think, considering the differences in sound hardware at play here, but also still kind of tinny in the way some might expect from Genesis hardware. It's not bad, but it's not flexing that YM2612 chip the way a lot of other games did. One interesting thing I found when combing over the admittedly scant development details for this game though, is that the Genesis version sound director was none other than Shogo Sakai, who at the time was still employed at Data East. Sakai might not be a name familiar to most, but any Nintendo music fans watching this might have their ears perk up a bit at the mention of his name. He moved on to HAL Laboratory shortly after this game's development wrapped, where he remained until 2023 when he became freelance. He's contributed to many Kirby soundtracks, including that of the anime, the soundtracks of both Super Smash Bros. Melee and Brawl, but his crowning achievement by far is serving as the sole composer for the final game in the Mother series, Mother 3. Kind of a weird tangent, I know, but it was pretty cool finding out this bit of trivia while researching the game. Back to VF2 itself though, the game plays okay, but you definitely lose quite a bit of depth by having VF2 stuck to 2 dimensions. The game stages do their best to capture the 3D counterparts though, even including ring outs. Whereas Toshinden arguably benefited from being transitioned to 2D thanks to how janky its polygonal counterpart is, Virtua Fighter 2 doesn't really gain anything from it here. It's an admittedly neat novelty though. Hilariously enough though, this version of Virtua Fighter 2 has been made available on far more platforms than the arcade original has, probably due to Sega reliably re-releasing their Genesis library at whatever chance they get. I think it's kind of cool that this version exists, but I can't help but wonder why it exists. It kind of puzzles me the same way TMNT Tournament Fighter's NES existence does. Interestingly enough, despite this version being handled by several Japanese studios, the game itself never actually released out there. When it comes to Mortal Kombat, the series has had a pretty interesting history in regards to trying to translate them to portables. Both the Game Gear and Game Boy versions of Mortal Kombat 2 are shockingly decent downports given the respective hardware of both platforms. The same can't be said for Mortal Kombat 4 on Game Boy Color. Being the first 3D entry in the series, getting this in a handheld form was always going to be a tall order, and certainly one much too tall for the main portable at the time, the Game Boy Color. The result was a 2D demake of the game that understandably plays closer to the first 3 games. I use the term play very loosely here, because you don't really play Mortal Kombat 4 on Game Boy. It's more like you're subjected to it. That said, when the next mainline Mortal Kombat game, Deadly Alliance, released on consoles a couple years later, we'd also get a demake of sorts for the much more capable Game Boy Advance, and the result? Well, it's not just the best portable Mortal Kombat effort up to that point in time, but it's actually still pretty impressive even today. Deadly Alliance GBA attempts to capture the feel of the main console versions by using sprites but in 3D arenas, which the 32-bit handheld could actually feasibly do, allowing for sidesteps. I really want to point out the visuals in a few stages, particularly ones with water or ice like the Lin Kuei Temple. You can see reflections of other stage elements in the ice or water, as well as the combatants themselves. Even when your character's auto animation changes via fight style switching, you can see a change in the reflection as well. We should probably talk about those fighting styles. Deadly Alliance introduces unique swappable fighting styles. These can be changed on the fly at the press of a button, even during certain dialogue combo strings, and change up a character's normals, though special moves remain universal across styles. This translates to Deadly Alliance GBA as well, though with some tweaks. Each character in the console version also got a weapon-based style in addition to the 2 hand-to-hand styles. On GBA, you can only swap between your 2 hand-to-hand styles. However, attacks from the weapon style are instead implemented as universal special moves, still giving you access to those attacks in a roundabout way. Also, the throw in this game has a hilarious sound effect. Roster-wise, the game's roster has been cut in half. The eponymous Deadly Alliance are still available, but are made unlockable characters as opposed to being available from the start on console. The crypt is also retained in the Game Boy Advance version, and where your unlocks will generally come from, assuming you have the currency to buy what you want. If you want a little boost to start off, try entering your profile name as Quick Cash when starting a new profile. You'll get 25k coins off the bat, more than enough to buy a few unlockables. The arcade ladder is retained as well, though there's one fun twist with the encounter against Shang Tsung and Quan Chi. Unlike on consoles where they both have separate fights on the ladder, Quan Chi first, then Shang Tsung, they both occupy the final spot on the ladder in the Game Boy Advance version, fighting Quan Chi in round 1 and Shang Tsung in round 2. What makes this interesting is that your health actually doesn't carry over between rounds, so it really makes things tense. I'm not sure if this was a change brought about by some kind of hardware concession or not, but I think it's actually pretty cool, and sells the Deadly Alliance dynamic even more. Overall, Deadly Alliance GBA is a pretty solid demake overall that manages to be both ambitious, but realistically reined in as well. However, it's only part of the story. Literally. The following year would see the release of Mortal Kombat Tournament Edition for the Game Boy Advance, which essentially functions as the second half of the game. It uses the same engine and gameplay as Deadly Alliance GBA, but swaps in the characters that were missing from the initial GBA release. This game also notably features the first playable appearance of Serena in the series, hailing from Sub-Zero mythologies. It's very much a companion to the first release and is also worth playing if you enjoyed that. One last thing I want to mention for both games are their sound quality. The GBA isn't known for having the greatest sound hardware out there, but in spite of that, Deadly Alliance's music particularly sounds really good on the GBA hardware. I would have honestly expected a scratchy, compressed mess, but no, this is one of the best sounding fighting games on the platform, hands down. It's absolutely crazy to me that the first MK release on GBA was an infamously botched UMK3 port, yet the demake of, at the time, the newest and most technically advanced Mortal Kombat title actually ended up way better than it had any right to. Reality really is stranger than fiction sometimes. There's one funny little honorable mention that I'd like to briefly touch on before the video is, well, over. Shrek Super Slam is a surprisingly dope 6th generation party fighter that most prominently takes inspiration from Power Stone of all things. I'm not kidding when I say it's dope though, the game even has a small competitive scene. No, seriously, look it up sometime. It ended up also getting released for the DS and Game Boy Advance. The DS version attempts to retain the 3D combat of the console versions, but the GBA version takes a different approach. While it still very much has the same format of depleting your opponent's life with special attacks and any items and weapons you can find, the perspective and stage design shifts to 2D and actually specifically starts resembling Smash Bros. More than Power Stone. As I said, the general format is still the same and you're not knocking people off of platforms to win, but because the stage design in general had to be completely retooled, it lends itself to being a more unique experience overall from every other version of the game, even the DS version. That's going to do it for this video. As always, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to the patrons that support the channel. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.